Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you had if you're living in the United States, hope you had a fantastic 4th of July weekend. Right here in America, right now, we've got an awful lot of political problems. We've got political corruption running rampant. We have persecution of Christianity that is unparalleled in American history. We've got broad-based, comprehensive, it seems, corruption in our judicial and political system. And yet, in spite of all that, we have more freedom in America than virtually any country in the world. And there's so much good about our American world, American society. Is America perfect? Absolutely not. America has made some unbelievably awful foreign policy decisions and practices down through the years. Much of it based on bad theology, I might add. But nonetheless, once again, in spite of all that, the average Joe like you and me, we have more freedom, more liberty to pursue happiness, if you please, than any country in the world. And that's an awful lot to be thankful for. And what that means is, here's an unpaid political advertisement. When it comes time to vote in November, we better not be voting with our pocketbook. We better be voting with our heads. And about who stands, at least verbiage-wise, and at least insofar as past policy is concerned, who stands in support of Christianity, who stands in spite of their personal lives of immorality. They've done more for the common good of the common man in America than other presidents have. And so, just a word there. If you don't like me saying things like that's fine. It's my liberty. It's my freedom to do so. And it's my blog. It's my show. So, there it is. All right? We are continuing our examination and study of the challenge of Christ. Boy, I tell you what, just over the last month or so, I've been involved in some discussions with some atheists, some skeptics, people who claim to be, quote, believers, unquote. They're not believers. They don't believe in the inspiration of Scripture. They don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. But they call themselves, quote, believers. The only thing they believe in is themselves. Honestly, they don't believe, once again, they don't believe in Jesus. They don't believe in the God of the Bible. And yet they try to use the Bible, which they don't believe in. They don't believe it's inspired. They try to use the Bible for their own nefarious, immoral, purposes. So I say that to say this. The challenge of Christ is more relevant, more pressing, more important that we be able to answer this challenge than maybe any time, certainly in American history. That challenge of Christ, as I've shared with you for several years now, is found in John chapter 10, verse 37. And just a little word here. I'll never forget the very first time I gave a lesson on the challenge of Christ. It was in Australia some years ago. And I presented what the challenge of Christ is. Now, mind you, I was speaking to a group of Christians. And yet, after that lesson, person after person after person after person came up to me and said, I've never, ever heard it expressed like this, of how important it is that we as believers be able to answer the challenge of Christ. They were blown away. And that's truly sad. Because Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer to every man who asks you a reason for the hope that lies within you. The word answer there, to give an answer to every man, is from the Greek word apologia, as I've shared with you before. And it means, in the original Greek, it means to give an orderly, logical defense of what we believe. So I want to ask you respectfully, kindly, but urgently, can you defend your faith against skeptics, atheists, Muslims, Jews who say your Jesus is a false prophet? Do you know why? Because he said he was coming back in the first century. He did not do it, therefore he lied, or he failed at the very least. Can you defend your faith against that challenge? So again, the challenge of Christ, John chapter 10 verse 37, do not believe me for my word's sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. And folks, make no mistake, some of the works that the Father gave Jesus to do was to come in judgment. The time of the judgment, the time of the resurrection at his parousia, his coming. Simply stated, if Christ did not come as he said he was going to, in the manner he said he was going to, and when he said he was going to, we're not even supposed to believe in him. And thus, in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, a passage I've shared with you many times, Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And I got to tell you, the efforts of futurists to avoid the power of this text are at times they're stunning. About 2 weeks ago, I had a guy post on Facebook on one of my blogs, and he says, well, in Matthew 16, 28, when Jesus said, verily I say unto you, that term there always introduces a new subject. Nothing could be more egregiously, blatantly, flagrantly, absolutely, teetotally, 100% false. I wrote a little book some years ago entitled, Can You Believe Jesus Said This? It's available on my website. In that book, I point out that the Greek term that is translated as verily I say unto you, the Greek term is amen lego humin. It appears something like somewhere between 88 and 95 times. I've forgotten the exact precise number at the moment. Not one time, totally opposite of what this fellow said, not one time does amen lego humin change a subject. Not one time does it introduce a new subject. Amen lego humin invariably calls attention to what is about to be said that is going to emphasize what has just been said. That means that verse 38 is emphasizing verse 27, not 38, 28. So what does verse 28 say? Verily I say unto you, there are some standing here, wait a minute, some standing here, not there, not 2,000 years away. Jesus didn't say there are going to be some people alive when I come. That'd be silly, wouldn't it? No, he was talking to, according to Mark chapter 8 and 9, he was talking to a large crowd. And he said, verily I say unto you, there are some standing here, that's his here, not our here, who shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And my goodness gracious, the attempts to avoid the power of that text. That text is often used by the skeptics and the atheists to prove Jesus didn't keep his word. I mean, after all, he was going to come back with the angels and judge every man. That's the end of time, we are told. That's the end of the last days, we are told. In reality, we are not in the last days. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been sharing with you the topic, investigating the topic, are we in the last days? Because after all, the Bible teaches that Christ was to come at the end of the last days. He was supposed to come on the, quote, last day, right? Well, in last week's program, I shared with you repeatedly. Let me repeat it again. Point number one, we are not in the last days. We are in the Christian age, and the Christian age has no end. Just this morning, I was reading in a really, really excellent little book entitled The Temple in the Gospel of Mark by Timothy Gray. In that book, he makes a very astute observation that with the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, this was the passing of the old age, the passing of one age, and the inauguration and establishment of another new creation. Now look, this guy's not a preterist, but he understands what the Bible teaches about the end of the age. The end of the age is not the end of the Christian age. It's not the end of time. It's the end of the Old Covenant age, which the temple at Jerusalem represented, that it symbolized. So that's point number one. Since we are not in the last days, that means the coming of the Lord is not in our future, because remember, the Lord was going to come, the resurrection would occur, the judgment would occur on the last day of the last days. So if the Christian age has no end, ladies and gentlemen, we're not looking for the last day. And we cannot be looking for the coming of the Lord at the end of the last days, since the age in which we're living has no end. Listen, I investigate and develop all of this in this book, The Last Days Identified. This book has transformed the lives of countless numbers of people. I cannot tell you the number of testimonials I have received about this book. This book transformed my life. This book took away the fear. This book made me see the Bible in a totally different way, and it's exhilarating. This book salvaged my faith. On and on and on about the testimonies from this book, or about this book, The Last Days Identified. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Go to the store, order the book, Last Days Identified. You'll be very, very glad that you did. Because let me reiterate what I said at the very ending of last week's program, and then I want to get into Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 to prove that we're not in the last days. And remember, Peter said, 2 Peter chapter 3, that the day of the Lord would be at the end of the last days. The new heaven and new earth would come at the end of the last days, at the last days day of the Lord. So anyway, sharing something with you here in regard to the last days. What does it mean if we are not in the last days? Well, it means there's not a man of sin in our future. It means that there's not a future rebuilt, quote, third Jerusalem temple, unquote. It means there is no red heifer sacrifice that's going to be made and purify the priesthood, the Temple Mount, etc., etc. That's all moot. Because you see, according to dispensationalism, that's supposed to take place in the last days. If we are not in the last days, or if the last days are not in our future, guess what? None of that stuff is true. If we're not in the last days, there is no rapture in our future. If we are not in the last days, there is no great tribulation in our future. If we are not in the last days, there is no end of time in our future. Folks, do you catch the power of this? Realizing, understanding, and appreciating that we are not in the last days, anticipating the end of the last days, is such an incredibly liberating and empowering reality. It takes away the fear of the future. Now, look, this is not some Pollyannish, pie in the sky, don't worry, kumbaya, let's all have a group hug. Okay. No, we face some real serious issues in our world. Here's the problem. An awful lot of the problems that we face in our world, the problems in the Middle East, are caused by bad eschatology. They're caused by believing that Israel still owns that piece of property over there as their divine right. Folks, that's false. You know what? Israel is supposed to be regathered to the land, unquote, in the last days. We're not in the last days. You see the implications of what I'm saying? So, once we realize we are not in the last days, all of the futuristic fear-mongering elements and doctrines that we hear on the TV, on the radio, in book after book after book, all of that is dispelled and destroyed by the truth that we are not in the last days. You've got to catch the power of this. Okay. As I suggested, I want to spend the rest of my time today, about 10 minutes, sharing with you the reality that we are not in the last days. And let me say this again that I touched on last week. Folks, if we're not in the last days, then when a skeptic starts talking to us about, oh, you know, Jesus said he was going to come in the last days, Jesus said he was going to come and put an end of time, we can say, no, you don't understand. You've got it all wrong. Jesus did not promise to come at the end of time. Jesus said he was going to come in the last days of the Old Covenant age, the end of the Old Covenant age, not the end of the New Covenant age. So when you accuse Jesus of failing because he didn't come in the first century, you're misunderstanding the identity of the last days. You're misunderstanding the doctrine of the last day. You're completely misunderstanding the doctrine of eschatology. It's not about the end of time. It's not about the end of the Christian age. It's about the end of the Old Covenant age that came. Indeed, it came in AD 70 with the dissolution and destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And it's game over. The skeptic is lost. He has no argument. He has no evidence. He has no foundation to stand on. You see how important this is? This is critical. Well, one of the most foundational prophecies of the last days is found in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. We could probably expand that to chapter 5, but I'm not going to. That's a purely arbitrary decision on my part, you understand. Well, I'm not going to take the time to read the entirety of Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. I'm going to ask, however, that you do so. Get your Bible out, and between now and next week, because I'm not going to be able to cover the entirety of Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, but do yourself a favor and read Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Pay very careful attention to what it actually says. Look at the context of what it's talking about. I think it will blow your mind. I was raised as an amillennialist, and we used to cherry pick Isaiah chapter 2 through 4. Just lift it right out of its context and quote it and say, well, see, Peter on the day of Pentecost said, we're in the last days. Well, Peter did say that. What Peter did not say is, the last days have begun today. No, he didn't say that. More on that later. So, I was taught that the last days began on Pentecost and will run until the last day at the end of the Christian age. That was the way I was raised. But I've already said enough. Demonstrating we're not in the last days. There is no last day. There is no end of time. So let's look at some of the passages. And again, we won't be able to look at every single verse in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, but we are going to look at some of the key, what I call nails. You know, I like nails. I don't mean metal nails. But what I mean by nails is, you know, you pound a hammer into the wall, into a stud, and you can hang things on. Well, I like scriptural nails. I like texts that are so clear, so undeniable, and so powerful that you can hang your hat on it. You can hang a doctrine on it and say, well, I may not understand an awful lot, but here's a nail, and I can hang my hat on it. And I'll have to assimilate all of this other stuff that I may not understand perfectly. I will have to conflate them with the nail. You understand what I'm saying here? Okay, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. In the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. And many people will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. Boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, when I was a young minister, I used to quote those passages, those verses, and say, see, look at this. This is a prediction of the establishment of the church. How do I know that? Because the house of the Lord is the church, 1 Timothy chapter 3. That you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, Paul wrote to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 3, 15 and following. So, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established. Wait a minute. We've got a problem here. Now remember, we are told that the last days are the Christian age. So if the last days are to be identified as the Christian age, then here's what Isaiah chapter 2 and following teaches. In the Christian age, the church will be established. Or, in the Christian age will be established. What? That's what you call a tautology. And it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's basically an argumentum ad absurdum. If the Christian age is the last days, and if the last days are already in existence, so that the church age, the Christian age, is established while the last days are in existence, you can't have the last days beginning after the last days have begun. You can't have the beginning of the last days within the last days that had already begun. It makes no sense whatsoever. But if we view Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 is saying, in the last days the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, then it says, while the last days are already in existence, as the last days are already flowing, the mountain of the Lord's house, the church, will be established. That makes worlds more sense. But what you see, the establishment of the church is supposed to be the establishment of the last days in the amillennial view of things. Even in the postmillennial view of things, in some parts of postmillennialism. So once again, folks, let me reiterate this because you've really got to catch this. Isaiah teaches that while the last days would already be in existence, they would be ongoing. while the last days would be in existence, the church would be established. But wait a minute. Once again, the traditional view in the amillennial and in some postmillennial circles is the establishment of the church is the establishment of the last days. Do you see the problem here? It's a huge problem. It's a fatal problem against the view that the last days refer to the Christian age. So at the very outset, in one of the key, most foundational Old Testament prophecies that is used to prove that the last days began on Pentecost, it proves just the opposite. It destroys the idea that the last days began with the establishment of the church. It proves the idea that the last days were already present when the church was established. And let me say again, you can't have the church being established in the church age. Because if the church age began with the establishment of the church, that's a major problem. Establishment of the church age, ongoing. But Isaiah says, in the last days, while the last days are already existing, the church will be established. No, that won't work. Do you see the problem here? So, once again, let me reiterate. In one of the most fundamental foundational prophecies of the last days that is used to prove that the last days began on Pentecost, it proves exactly the opposite. Now, we haven't gotten very far, have we? So next week, we're going to take a look at what else was going to take place in the last days, and that is the establishment of the mountain of the Lord and the temple of the Lord, that is the church of the living God. Another way of putting it is, it's the establishment of the kingdom of Christ. The kingdom would be established in the last days. I'll see you next week.